The East African tradition of the Maasai tribe is to greet one another with the words Kasirian Ngera, which is Swahili for, so how are the children? In that community, the well-being of their children is the highest priority. If you are interested in participating in thought-provoking conversations about the well-being of children and families, please tune in every Wednesday at 3 p.m. to Fresh Start Today on 860 AM WNOV. Together, we can save our children.
So we're back on Fresh Start today for our second half, and we have a very special guest on the line, Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is an internationally renowned lecturer and consultant on matters of race, culture, and education. She is the author of Relationship-Based Models for Both Education and Management and has developed the African American Male Youth Respect Scale. Among her numerous presentations, she has been a speaker at the UN Conference of Race in Barbados, the National Association of Black Social Workers Annual Conference, and the Essence Women of Leadership Summit. Dr. DeGruy teaches at Portland State University. We are so glad and honored to have on Fresh Start today Dr. Joyce DeGruy. Good afternoon, Dr. DeGruy.
Good afternoon. How is everyone?
Everybody's
Wonderful.
Doing great.
Wonderful.
You know, you did a phenomenal job, as always, at the Social Development Commission's Summit on Poverty. And I just want to say thank you for bringing your wealth of knowledge, your energy to the city of Milwaukee. And certainly we can't wait for you to come back and help us move forward in some of the things that you had talked about in your presentation.
My pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure.
So the first thing I want to say, you know, my ground rules, if you will, is that, one, we have to be completely honest and tell the truth. And I think you're a person that will have no problem following that rule.
Absolutely.
So I say to you, Kasirian Ngera, which simply is, how are the children? And that's what we're here on this platform, to kind of look at the well-being and the welfare of children and their families. And so you have done a lot of work around post-traumatic stress and the impact of slavery on our current conditions. And so we want to kind of talk about that today in this conversation, which is titled How to Interrupt Psychological Terror, Revictimization, and Hopelessness as it relates to oppression. So hopefully our listening audience will understand what psychological terror is and be able to recognize its cycle, explain the differential treatment that blacks that treatment of blacks in response to community trauma, and how black parents can help their children process trauma. You know, examples: domestic violence, homicides, police shootings, incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. But also, how does racism and stress impact our medical, emotional, and mental health? And finally, how do we internalize and normalize oppression? So my question is, and I want to start with a quote from Gil Noble, who wrote, Dr. DeGruy is a priceless asset to us all. She has lifted the bandages from 400 years, from the 400-year-old abscess of slavery that remains unhealed. Dr. DeGruy, can you tell me about what this abscess of slavery is and how it has impacted not only black folks, but also white folks in the 21st century?
Well, if you have a couple of days, I can explain that in great length.
Well, we got the time.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay. Well, I think that, first of all, what I was looking at in my research around African Americans and historical trauma is one of those things where, when you hear about black people and you put together African Americans and slavery, what the first thing I started to realize is people get all twisted about that and have a real difficulty connecting those. Now, for me, I find it difficult to not connect them. Okay, I don't see how you cannot connect, over 300 years of chattel slavery. I don't understand how you cannot connect it to contemporary issues affecting African Americans. The reason why I say that is because if you look at other groups, when I talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome, I'm talking about multi-generational trauma. It's not deep. This is pretty straightforward. So the question then becomes, what were the traumas? How were they transmitted? How are they impacting us today? Well, the way to unpack that is to understand how we've looked at other groups in the world. You know, we've looked at, for example, indigenous Native Americans, and we've looked at a group of people who have the highest suicide rate in this country, that have never actually healed from the horrors of colonization and being forced off their native lands. It's created a severe wound, which Native people refer to as an unresolved grief. If you look at Aboriginal folks in Australia, you'll see similar kinds of debilitating self-depreciation and self-destruction when you begin to assault someone's culture as their culture was assaulted in Australia. If you look at almost any other group, you know, we begin to be able to somehow crystallize how their traumas have impacted them culturally and the generations that proceeded from it. I was always intrigued by the idea that somehow we could immediately understand the notion of Holocaust, for example. Everybody, you say Holocaust, everybody, you know, it's a deep sigh, my God. We all are clear about Holocaust and how the impact of the Holocaust has impacted Jewish people to this day, to the point where we understand all of the organizations that have been formed to support, protect, and acknowledge a horrific event in the history of Jewish people that to this day impact Jewish people. So why then does it become difficult to understand how over 300 years of American chattel slavery, brutalization, being sold, beaten, raped, mutilated, and then after slavery being lynched, then being segregated and being oppressed, all the way to contemporary police use of deadly force and differential treatment in every major institution in America. Somehow we can't make that leap. We can't see it. And what I did was I basically, you know, drew a straight line. It's a straight line. There's never been a point in our history since slavery, one, that anyone acknowledged or apologized for it in any real way or offered any repair, and have continued the oppressive policies. This has continued to contemporary society. So these are things that in the presentation that you were able to participate in, I was able to share in great detail. So this trauma that I'm talking about is not only originates with slavery, but was perpetuated after slavery through oppressive policies that continue to, again, assault us today.
So do you think, in terms of healing this abscess, this wound, that talking about it is essential?
Of course, it's absolutely essential. You know, first is to know, then to do. You can't fix what you don't understand.
Right.
You can't heal what you don't acknowledge or recognize. And again, once you get to the point where you've been put upon, I shared this, and I want to kind of put it out there to your listening audience, is that what happens to folks, you know, we're human beings, and we respond to whatever's going on in our environment, in our world, in a way that we adapt and we try to adjust in order to survive. Matter of fact, every living thing does that. So what happens to people, you know, and I gave the analogy of if, for example, there's a door and you're a child, and what you've noticed is that anyone that looks like you that goes near the door is beaten down or killed. Well, after a while, what you learn is, I better not go to that door. Now, after a while, not only is the door not locked, there's no one there, and the door is open. And still the child may look and go, I don't think so. My dad wasn't able to go through that door, and my mom wasn't able to go through that door. So guess what? I'm not going to even try to go through that door. That's called learned helplessness, or vicarious learned helplessness. In other words, if the people I trust and believe in, the big people, can't seem to make it through those doors, then I'm certainly not going to try. And so after a while, you have folks that internalize this sense of helplessness, and it then becomes modeled and learned by those in the environment, children, youth, and hence community. So when we look at these barriers, these structures that kind of stop us from being able to grow, there are tons of those. I mean, my research, you know, I revealed lots of those, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a man or a woman, to how we have friendships, to how we bond and or not, to how we achieve and how we feel about others' achievement, all of those things are colored by what we learn in our environment. And if that environment is filled with folks that have been broken and it's systems that continue to injure us, then again, you're going to create a debilitating situation, which is part of what, we learn and we've passed along, sometimes unknowingly. So we have to tell the truth in order to get to the point where we can heal. We've got to acknowledge the big, nasty, ugly abscess in order to eventually treat it and to remove any poison that might be there. So we have to first tell the truth.
Okay.
And it's,
Go ahead.
always the secrets that make us sick. It's always secrets.
So when we talk about this, telling the truth and talking about the traumas that we have experienced and some of the barriers and structures that have been placed to prevent us from progressing. And, you've talked about the black codes in your book, but Jim Crow laws. There's a number of things that were instituted and even federal laws to promote racism. But why do you think that black people as well as white people don't like to talk about racism?
Well, first of all, that's a very interesting thing. Because first, once you acknowledge something, once you acknowledge it, you can't unknow it, right? Once you state it, it's out there and it's real. Well, it's very easy to understand why white people won't talk about racism. White people have lived and grown up and survived in a culture of denial, and that denial is so great. They believe kind of in this mythology. My colleague and friend Peggy McIntosh talks about the myths that white people are raised with that produces the behavior, the racist behavior that we see. They simply don't believe it because it actually creates cognitive dissonance for them. It conflicts with everything they've come to know and believe about themselves. We are noble, we are superior, we are intelligent, we are civilized. These are the attributes that they have been told that they inherently possess. And when you talk about American chattel slavery and the behavior of whites, government all the way down to Miss Ann, the behaviors don't fit that ideology. It does not fit that notion of that virtuous a person, those characteristics. And so what happens is you have an opportunity there to go, okay, so maybe I need to kind of readdress this, become more introspective. Maybe I need to unpack what I've learned. But instead they say, no, you must be wrong. Oh, no, you're the one. You're the bad person because I will not entertain the idea that I in any way am connected to that contradictory, that dissonance that you're sharing with me. As it relates to black people, there's deep injury associated with this. Very deep injury. If you talk to a lot of elders, they'll tell you they don't want to talk about that because it somehow folded into that are deep fears and pain and humiliation and anger and angst. All of those things are folded into this notion of racism, you see. And at the same time, we have a generation of people, of young people, the millennials and our youth and children of today that are clamoring to understand because they're seeing the difference in how people move through the world, and particularly people that look like them. They're seeing it, but they have no context to understand why and how it's happening. So I think there's a resistance from those who, and you have to also remember, most of us, look at Malcolm, look at Martin, look at Mandela, look at anyone who arose to really speak to or confront these inequities and this racism. It didn't end well. Right. You know what I'm saying? It didn't end well for them in terms of what happens to you when you begin to speak truth to power. So I think there's all of those are parts and pieces, and then there's the other one. Folks don't understand it because we've never had the conversation. We've never had the real education or the real truth about our history in this country. So there is, again, a profound amount of ignorance about it.
Wow. And that ignorance is costly.
Oh, yeah.
Because in the Jewish community, you often hear that they refuse to forget. I think their mantra is never forget. Never forget. Why do you think in that community that they have embraced telling the story and continue to, the oral tradition and passing it down. And when I think about what's going on with young people, black children and youth in America today, in terms of how they are functioning, what is it that we can learn from the Jewish community about their Holocaust and their resilience?
Well, one of the things that I recognize, and we have to kind of understand, I just had an incredible meeting, had the opportunity to hear Jim Brown speak a couple nights ago. And he and I want to speak to this on a very real and a very critical level. I'm going to answer this question a little differently. What Jim Brown spoke about, and for those of you look him up if you don't know who he is. He's an incredible man who was an incredible activist throughout the 60s. Anyway, Jim stood up a couple nights ago and he said, we would be remiss if we did not look at the level of violence that is occurring within our communities. We're talking about these are black people killing black people. He says we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge what's going on around this country in places like Chicago, Baltimore, wherever you look. You're looking at this critical piece where black people are actually killing black people. And what, I hope to get an opportunity to speak to him about, because he was absolutely correct. He says, if we don't talk about this, we lose our credibility. And let me kind of speak to this as it relates to Holocaust. So the problem is we're looking at these behaviors and we're going, why is it we can't collectively come together? Why is it we do so much harm to each other? And you cannot separate that. You see, the problem is we don't know how we got here. For example, when Mr. Brown was young, there was two-parent households. There were things called family and extended family in your life at all times. There was something called neighborhood and community, you see. And that buttress, while racism was alive and well, what you had as a protective buttress for that was this sense of connection with one another. Since that time, we have all but destroyed the family. You're looking at children, several generations of children that have raised children, meaning no one was parented. There was no mature adult present. You're looking at the introduction of crack cocaine and the impact it's had. Do you see what I'm saying? So when we look at over here and we go, why is Johnny behaving this way? And why aren't we able to pull together as other groups have, means to ignore the real true history that perpetuated the kinds of ills that are producing what we see today. Does that make sense?
So the continual assault on black life in America.
Exactly.
Wow.
But never, ever, it's almost like it's such an amazing thing. When people talk to me, I think very few people push back too far with me anyway around slavery, because I'm sitting here looking at folks going, are you really going to try to suggest to me that somehow slavery ended hundreds of years of dehumanization and brutalization of a people? Somehow the playing field got leveled and everybody ought to be fine? Are you really trying to tell me that? I know too much for that. And so when and not just me, I mean, the data is really clear. There are people who have Richard Rothstein, who's a Berkeley fellow. This is a man who spent 30 years looking at the institutional, structural, political, governmental sanctioning of discrimination. He pulls out the laws. He says, let me explain to you what has happened here. You want to know why Ferguson happened? Oh, well, let me just show you. This is a white man that spent 30, 40 years looking at this stuff. There are people that have... So, in other words, what I'm seeing is, one, the knowledge, the information, there are volumes of it. We don't have to wonder how or why. The only thing we got to wonder about right now is why there is no accountability for the blatant truth about this. So, in other words, very, very recently, there was I read an article. There were several articles that have been done on implicit and explicit bias, right? And in these tests to determine or assess whether people have implicit bias, one of the things that the researchers said is that police, for example, are very resistant to taking any tests that would show bias. Resistant, right? Now you have to understand, when you look at police unions, firefighters unions, any of these teachers unions, all of these things have been set up to keep things in place as they are and to not hold folks accountable, particularly folks around racism. and oppressive practices. So what we have to understand is the system itself that we're looking at. The systems have been built by the very people we're just trying to sit around and figure out how and why. Jewish people, on the other hand, maintain the solidarity of their community in spite of everything else. They work together. They support each other. You don't even have to like each other, but they're going to make certain they're going to keep it within the Jewish community. They're going to support Jewish entrepreneurs. They're going to produce. They're going to basically support all Jewish ventures, right? And it's not about whether I like you or not. It's about what we do as a people to sustain ourselves. And so when we look at different communities, we have to be very careful not to impose a lens that is not an appropriate or an accurate one as it relates to our community. So when we're saying why Johnny can't read, we got to go back some to figure out why Johnny can't read. Instead of blaming it on Johnny, you can't even just blame it on Johnny or Johnny's mama. You got to go look, where does Johnny's mama live? Why was she living there? What resources and were her parents able to bequeath to her? What did she receive as a mental, emotional, spiritual, financial support? Where is it? And so you have to begin to understand that what we're seeing today has been in the works for a long, long time. And now we can't look at this and go, well, I don't understand. How can we not understand? The only reason why we don't get it is because we have a big old giant gap in our understanding of our history in this country. Huge gap. We've never been taught the right stuff or the truth.
You know, you talk about this lens and assessing our current conditions through a historical lens. You're really big on that, the importance of that. So when we look at marriage conditions today, when we look at fathering today, when we look at just parenting, overall parenting and employment situations, behavioral health, I work in the area of foster care. And what I've done. Huh?
Bless you.
And in Milwaukee County, we have 68% of our local foster care community is made up of black families. 12% of that community is made up of Hispanics, which is 80% of the children who are in need of out-of-home care. But 80% of the workforce is Caucasian, at least. So you have a cultural disconnection there. And so when I'm looking at this historical lens, I'm looking at particularly like we'll have a African-American mother and mothers and fathers who are opposed to their children being assessed, through psychological evaluations and IEPs or administer certain type of tests or given psychotropic medications. And folks will go back to the court and say this parent is uncooperative or non-compliant and as a result risk and have lost their parental rights. So when we look at this from your angle, this historical lens, can you talk about why African Americans are resistant to having certain tests done on them?
I'll tell you someone that's a lot better at answering that question, and that's Harriet Washington. Harriet Washington wrote a book called Medical Apartheid.
Yes.
And what she talks about and what she calls it is iatrophobia. And it's a fear of the healer. It's a fear. And it's a fear that's born of people who have experienced horrific assaults. So what happens is you have, I actually write about it in my book, just this whole idea that, people reach a point where they begin to not trust the systems that have injured them profoundly. And it absolutely makes sense. You begin to distrust those who have done you harm consistently. And so this results in this, what is referred to as iatrophobia, right?
Yes.
And what Harriet Washington talks about is, she says that we have never dissected the shameful medical neglect, flawed medical experimentation, and the resulting fear that perpetuates the huge gulf in terms of health disparity, right? She said you have to begin to look at people that have been put upon consistently over and over again, really medically abused and experimented on for hundreds of years, with folks with total impunity. And so it doesn't surprise me that folks distrust these folks. What bothers me, honestly, the most, here's what's deep for me. If you have a doctor, right, that consistently, is killing people when he operates, there's a level of accountability that shows up for him. Right, there's some accountability.
Right.
We're going to take your license. You don't just get to keep practicing. Mm-hmm. When we look at the foster care system, when we look at criminal justice, when we look at mental health, when we look at education, we are looking at practitioners that are failing miserably.
Yes.
And yet there is no accountability that says, excuse me, Miss Ann, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Hello, maybe it's this officer and these people have been shown to have implicit bias, which shows up in seeing black folks with guns when they don't have them, looking at children and thinking they're adults, being so quick to associate negative attributions to dark-skinned people. Then maybe you can still do what you do, but you can't do it in my community.
Right.
Because you see, none of these folks are held accountable for that behavior. Because these unions and who are made up, come on, let's look at who's making the calls.
Right.
And so you have systems that are set up to not manage themselves as it relates to people of color, because we, again, don't count. And what happens to black folks after a while, we're going, no, you're not accepting my child. You're not getting ready to put another label on them. You're not getting ready to cripple us. I'm not, and I don't trust or believe you. So that makes sense to me. But the larger problem is the people who are telling them that are people that they historically have not trusted. And now you're telling me I have to go in here and I have to listen to someone who I believe has, can, and will do me harm and my children.
Wow, that's really deep. So when we look at this, because there is distrust and justifiable distrust of systems, because historically government systems have not been favorable to black people. And whether we're talking about the medical industry, the healthcare industry, healthcare, behavioral health, education community, we have seen bias and discrimination in all of these. My concern is, how do we deal, because we know oppression is there, we know these barriers are there, how do we deal with African Americans who work inside of these systems and who do not, I don't want to say who do not represent the best interests of black folks?
You're talking about Stephen.
And I mean, there's a long list. I mean, these Quimbos and Sambos. How do we deal with that internalized oppression?
That's right. Well, they've always been there. I mean, again, I think Django, as reprehensible as the movie was, the character of Stephen that Samuel L. Jackson played, I thought was wonderful. And I even understand Samuel L. Jackson's excitement about playing that character, because we've always met them. We know those people and we meet them. And they're often placed in positions of power within our communities and within those institutions you're talking about.
Yes.
They're placed there as gatekeepers. They are people who have post-traumatic slave syndrome in the worst way and will do more injury to the people that look like them than the folks that don't look like them will. So here's the answer to that. One of the things I do is, I actually really confront organizations about who they've hired and how they've hired them. Okay. I also teach African Americans within those systems to learn how to circumvent those kind of people, because usually you can't remove them. White people have placed them in that position deliberately for the purpose of being the black gatekeeper or the Latino gatekeeper. They come in all forms. But they find these people who have internalized self-hatred or loathing, and they put them in these positions, and they're so happy that they're there that they'll take out everybody black that shows up. So we've got to, first of all, know and understand who these folks are, which means is, for example, when I send someone, when I was working, and trust me, I've worked in mental health and social services for 30 years, over 30 years. One of the things that I would do, for example, I'd send someone over to the welfare office or social security office or employment office, wherever I'm sending them. And I'm going, all right, here's some folk I want you to avoid. Okay? When you go over there, no matter what. Matter of fact, not only do I not want you to deal with this person, don't talk to anyone except Renee. Ask for Renee. She's not there, you go home.
Wow.
if it gets to the point where they're in a crunch, I'm going, all right, because see, I know Renee, I've vetted her. I've vetted Renee. So I'm not going to send you to someone I have not vetted, even if they look like us.
Right.
Then there are people that look like us that they will try to hook people up with. And I say to them, if they try to hook you up with this person, don't do it. Give some kind of excuse. I'll tell them. I literally do that with folks.
Okay.
Because, or for example, my sister. You know, my sister was absolutely a phenomenal, amazing, smartest person in our family. My sister knows systems like no one else I know. And very often, you know, I will look at policies or look at bills that are being passed, and I run it by my sister, and she goes, let me tell you who proposed that bill. Let me tell you a little bit about their background. Let me tell you about who they are and why they are to be trusted. I mean, she in other words, I check with her. When someone says to me, Joy, I want you to go, and you're going to be in Chicago, and I'd like you to meet with Mr. So-and-so. And I find out, you know, Mr. So-and-so is African American. I call my people on the ground. I'm going, who is this person I'm getting ready to meet? Matter of fact, when I get asked, like, you asked me to do this interview,
yes.
Right? You know I checked, right?
Well, whoever gave a good recommendation, I appreciate that.
But you see, that's because you got vetted.
Right.
Right.
And I was like, okay, is this someone I want to do this interview with, or is this someone who's not working on our behalf that's going to maybe use this and slant it in such a way that it might cause harm to our community?
Right. Right.
That's how serious I am about that, because those folks are there because, once again, we're injured. We've never been healed. Now, some of those folks I'm talking about, with some help, we can turn them around. The problem is they've been given the same system of error and ignorance and miseducation as everyone else. And they simply don't know. And sometimes when you can get them informed, they will step out of that role of being the gatekeeper. Are you following what I'm saying?
Yes.
But we have to be real honest. I appreciate that you started this with talking about telling the truth. But we've got to be able to tell the truth. I'm not, you know, I look at these brothers and sisters, I'm going, look, I don't have any ulterior motive, but my bottom line is to do no harm, nor to let you do harm. Okay?
Nor to let you do harm, yes.
Nor to let you do harm. And if I find out, one, I'm going to try to get you out of the position of being able to do harm. If not, I'm going to figure out how to help folks survive in spite of you.
Dr. DeGruy, you talked about, you know, this invisibility of black folks, you know, and white mainstream not acknowledging us, not placing value on our lives. But how there's some folks, and I believe in your book you refer to it as vacant esteem, that's what you just talked about, where educated folks or folks who have been declared as competent is compelled to move amongst our people that they have been taught or conditioned to despise?
That is right.
Right.
And I didn't say that. That's Carter G. Woodson.
Okay, thank you for correcting me, because, you know, I listen to everything that you produce. But these folks exist. And so why do we be silent? That's why, because I know that we don't have voice, but some of us, when we come into a space where, let's just say me as an African-American business owner, and I contract with the government, I often feel that folks who contract, black folks who contract with or work for the government are not allowed to bring all of who they are into a room.
I don't think just they can bring all of who they are into a room. Most black folks where they work can't bring all of them into who they are into the room. That's the nature of surviving and living in America.
Wow.
And so I think that, you know, Maynard Jackson, I had the honor and opportunity to meet Maynard Jackson, mayor of Atlanta, and Maynard Jackson was at a Blacks in Government conference. Actually, it was Black Mayors conference, and I was able to attend. And each one of the mayors stood and talked about, you know, what is necessary to build community and to really protect black communities. And Maynard said, there's a couple things we have to do. He said the first thing we have to do is we got to get rid of the incompetent Negro. And this is the person who we continue to prop up in spite of the fact that they're incompetent.
My God.
He says we lose all credibility as a people when we do that. We do it, and very often, you know, with these pastors that come out doing crazy stuff, and then all of a sudden God forgives them and they're fine. You know?
Right.
That kind. When we are not holding our own folks accountable, we prop them up. He says the second thing we got to get rid of is the scared Negro, and this is the Negro that gets the position in the government position or the position of authority or power, and are so afraid that they're going to lose that position that they actually become almost snipers, as it relates to other black folks. And Maynard, he spoke about that from a point of experience in dealing with those kind of toxic individuals. And so he says we can't continue to not acknowledge what you're saying right now, the crazies. We've got to be willing to take you, and whether we do that publicly, because I'm saying is take them in the back room, have that conversation with them. A nice little back room with a collective group of people to let you know you're not right. We're not going to, bust you out publicly. But then if you continue to do it, we're going to have to take you down. We're going to have to do whatever we have to do to remove you from that position.
Right.
That is our responsibility to our children, to our community, not to prop up this individual that is clearly incompetent.
So we're talking about shared accountability here.
Absolutely.
Wow. So we got to get rid of the incompetent Negro and the scared Negro.
And the scared Negro.
I love it. Now, there's a couple more questions that I have, and we are really enjoying this conversation. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to allow folks to call in. We'll take 2 calls, and that phone number in 10 minutes is 414-444-5250, 414-444-5250, for 2 individuals who would like to ask a question, not give a dissertation, not give a long speech, ask a brief question of Dr. Joy DeGruy. You'll be able to do that in 10 minutes. But I want to talk about 2 things because, you have done a lot around enlightening us about evidence-based practice and how that does not always work in black folks' favor, because we're really big on whether or not this is evidence-based. And we see a lot of that in social work, and in behavioral health studies. So talk to me about what are the dangers of things being evidence-based?
Well, I don't think there's any danger, actually, in something being evidence-based. If you take it for what it's saying that there's evidence that it works. That's all evidence-based means, is that we have looked at it, and we've found evidence, which means that we've somehow measured it and assessed it to be effective. That's all evidence-based is. It's another buzzword that folks are using to get certain people money and to take money away from others. That's all that is. Understand? We always have them.
Absolutely.
There was another one called diversity training that did the same thing. Okay. Basically, more white people got paid for diversity training than anybody of color.
Wow.
Of course, because what they did is they said, I see, we've been discriminating. Well, guess what? I'm going to build a corporation around diversity. It's going to be white people that are going to get the grants and the money and all of the stuff, and we're going to go and we're going to now help you people that we've broken up. And they literally made and nothing happened. Literally nothing changed, except white people made money off of even injuring us further. So, that's why, again, it's a buzzword. So when you look at evidence-based, we can't be afraid of that, because I wanted to have evidence. If someone's getting ready to do any kind of construction on my house, I want some evidence that suggests they have the capacity to do that, because I don't want them to tear up my house. I don't want a dentist working on me. I need something to identify that you know what you're doing. And so that's what evidence-based is about. I think what happens is when white people start measuring what is effective, they're measuring things based on their perception of what that looks like.
Yeah.
So that white standard, and typically it's a middle-class standard.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, for example, let me give you a perfect example. I wrote an evidence-based model for a program I've been working with for years. And one of the things was they were trying to say, well, how we're going to look at people, we want to get people from crisis. Now, this is basically a chart. They're looking at a chart. So this is crisis, families coming in crisis, and we want to move them to thriving. Okay, so then we have to now assess what happens to people when they're in crisis, when a person is stabilized, when they're doing sufficiently or appropriately, they're actually functioning at a healthy level, and then there's a point in which they actually are thriving, right? So we were going through trying to identify what that looked like. And so they said, well, in order for a person to be at the point of being stable, in order for them to be stable, they can't be receiving food stamps. I said, what? They said, well, no, if you're stable, you don't need food stamps. I said, no, you've got that all wrong. I said, half the people I know that are in school are on food stamps. I said, I know families that where they're sending kids to school, they're working, but guess what? They're on food stamps, and the fact that they're on food stamps is not an indication that they're not stable. Right?
Right,
so
right.
I'm having this argument with a white upper middle class woman who's getting ready to tell me what stable looks like for a black family. And from her vantage point, you can't possibly be stable if you have to use food stamps. I said, wait a minute, let me be clear. I was on food stamps.
Yeah.
All through school, I was on food stamps.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Right.
But the perception, and so we argued, we went back and forth about how are you going to define these areas so that when we say that we took this family from crisis to stable to thriving, who's going to make that determination of what that looks like? Because you don't walk through the world like the folks I'm talking about, right? Same thing happened in mental health when I was doing therapy with folks. And they were talking to me about blurred lines and, dual relationships and, having difficulty with transference and countertransference. I said, are you kidding me? I said, when I get in a room with somebody black, if I don't come to them real, if I don't come to them with an understanding that neither one of us are undefeated when we walk in that room, neither one of us are undefeated. So when I walk in that room, I don't sit up there and pretend that I'm undefeated. I'm going to sit up there and I'm going to say, yeah, I know you got some scars that may be a little different from mine, but we all got them.
Right, right.
Now we can have a conversation where the white therapist is going to go, well, I'm sorry, this isn't really about me. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to talk about me. This is all about you. And I'm going to tell you where to put that and sit on it and twirl. Because I don't trust you. What do you think? I don't know that you got broken parts. So when black people get in rooms with folks and you want me to undress myself to you, a stranger, I'm going to ask you to show me yours. And see, that doesn't fit any model of ethical standards as it relates to your work in mental health.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Now, I had one of the highest success rates of any case manager at any point in the city of Portland. My clients, whoever you put in front of me, did well. But guess what? I got written up every other day because I didn't do it the way they told me to.
Wow.
And yet I was effective with the people that were sitting across from me, and particularly the people that look like me.
That's powerful.
And rather than acknowledge that, rather than acknowledge that or give any credence to it, the way they responded, those that had licenses is, oh, she's improper, she is unethical, she is inappropriate, she is all unprofessional. All of these things would be said about me because they couldn't do it.
Right.
And because they couldn't do it, the way to deal with it is I can't say that I have a deficiency. I have to say there's something inherently wrong with you. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, this is a professional standard. And that's why I said, when I work with people around how to work with people of color, particularly African-American people, I have to look at them and say, okay, so I know you're a licensed clinical psychologist. You're not likely to be able to do the things I'm going to need for you to be able to do to be successful with these families.
Right.
I can work with a social worker, but if you're looking at defining yourself by the ethical standards of psychology, you're going to be breaking rules.
That is powerful.
Again,
Can you say that again about breaking the rules? If you're going to really help some of our people.
Yes. You're going to have to break what you believe to be your professional rules. And the way they do that, they hold folks, and this is what they call accountability. But you see, it doesn't matter about your lack of success in working with people of color. Because whatever model you're using is working for the white folks you're working with. But it doesn't matter that it doesn't work for the people of color you're working with. So you're not held accountable for that. You just say there's something wrong with them. And if I'm a practitioner that happens to be a psychologist that happens to be effective, then we're going to have to question my methods or my approaches or the degree of competence I have understanding clinical practice. And that's the when you start talking, when I told you every system that we are in as people of African descent, we are unable to bring our full, true, and authentic selves to the room.
Yes.
Because it's never been valued. And you got to remember who the people who wrote the rules. For example, I'll do this last one for people who may not really be clear about what I'm saying. Northwest Regional Educational Laboratories, really well known for all of its work around education, assessing systems, evaluating programs, looking at the achievement gap, those kind of things. Well, they were doing some research around small children. I believe these were either third or fourth graders. I'm not certain anymore. But they took a group of children, all white children that were third or fourth graders. They gave them the instructions on what to do. There was an activity they wanted them to do. And what it was they had a bunch of shapes. And they said to these children, we're going to give you 30 seconds, and we're going to need you to arrange these shapes in order. That was the only directions that were given to them. So they finished the project in 30 seconds. They were very proud, the little children. And they had all the squares, all the rectangles, all the triangles, all the ovals. They had all of these things stacked up in together. Well, they asked the very same question of a group of Native American children of the same age. They gave the same directions, and they said, what we need you to do is, again, arrange these shapes in order. The children achieved the task in 30 seconds. They were quite proud. They had all the red ones, the green ones, and the blue ones together. They didn't even notice the shapes. But the first thing they saw was color, which in their culture was more important to them. But the test maker had an ideal answer in mind. And the ideal answer would be to arrange them by shape. Now, I have to ask myself as a social scientist and a clinician and an educator, is there something in the hard wiring of the brain that says you should see shape? Answer, no. Okay,
right.
No, it's not in the hard wiring. And there's nothing to suggest that these children are more correct than the others. Yet, if you were the test maker, you've already decided who's correct. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so what happens then is we begin to attribute some level of intelligence, knowledge, appropriate rightness to something that is arbitrary and culture-based. And so what happens to us in these systems is we're consistently being shown to be the people who somehow are deficient. But that's how it happens over and over again. And I was one of those people throughout my university. I have 4 degrees, 3 of them advanced. And throughout that entire time, I questioned everything they told me. They got to the point where, and I would say to the point, it would get to the point where I'd go, am I correct? I go, am I correct in my assessment that you've arrived at this based on something that is pretty much arbitrary, not in the hard wiring, not an assessment of intelligence, right?
Yes.
And they would go, well, that is a very interesting point. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that would happen to me throughout my education, and I called it every single time. But how about the students sitting in the room that doesn't have the wherewithal or the propensity to want to call it? You see, they become injured, and they also become brainwashed into believing what is in fact measurable, evidence-based, and that which is basically culture-based and subjective, or you don't get to get a real clean sense of things. So when we start saying stuff like evidence-based, it shuts down a lot of black folks because they're just looking at it as one more hoop they've got to jump through. Do you see? And
Yes,
I
ma'am.
get that. I totally get that. But what I do with black organizations, nonprofits, is I help them to unpack what that really means. And I also help them understand how their effectiveness, that they happen to, by the way, not have been measuring, right? I said, no, you've been effective. How many of these kids, how many of their parents do you think come into the room or come into your facility to engage with their kids? Well, almost all of our parents. I said, do you know most organizations are unable to get that level of parent involvement and participation? Right. Have you ever measured that? Well, no. Well, here's how I want you to start measuring that. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So there's this notion that if we didn't measure it, then that means we don't have any evidence. That's not true.
Right.
That's not true. And so what I do is I help people not to be afraid of the evidence, but to learn how to measure their evidence. Gotcha. And where you're not doing well, how to kind of fix that. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Before I take the call from the line, I have one question for you. I know we have about 10 minutes left on this interview. But, some folks are under the illusion that slavery ended in 1865. And when I think about the presence of black folks in special education, foster care, adoption, juvenile correction, and adult corrections, my question to you, Dr. Joy DeGruy, is America still selling black children, buying and selling black children?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last thing.
I said, given the presence of black folks in criminal justice system, juvenile correction system, foster care, adoption, special education, I'm just wondering if America is still buying and selling black children.
America is still buying and selling black children and other children as well, and what very, very much so. And I think that my sister Michelle Alexander did a phenomenal job in describing that in her book, The New Jim Crow.
Yes.
And I think that these systems, America. I have a presentation that I do where I really help people understand how America has always existed with a slave labor force. We always have.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, it was Chinese laborers, it was the Latinos and migrant workers. It was African enslaved folks. It was, they've always, and the new slave labor force are those who are incarcerated or otherwise placed in systems where, we benefit from them. In other words, people live on the misery, index. They live on the misery. And the more there is misery, the more you're going to find that it's white people getting paid for it. And so these institutions are, in fact, benefiting from crippling individuals and or otherwise displacing them or, again, enslaving them in some form of labor. And that's what's happened, but it's always happened. There's this mythology that, again, after slavery ended, guess what happened? It didn't end. Okay?
It didn't end. Wow.
And it's got a word. It's got a name. It's called peonage.
Wow. We have a caller on the line. We have Pat on Fresh Start today. Pat, do you have a brief question or brief question for Dr. DeGruy?
Oh, that's what I wanted to. Hi, thank you very much for taking my call.
Please turn your radio down.
Oh, I'm sorry. I caught this conversation like in the middle, and I didn't hear who the doctor's name was.
Dr. Joy DeGruy. She's the author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Your question is?
I don't have a question. I have a comment to say. I am so glad to hear this kind of conversation on the radio. Wherever I want to get her book and wherever she is lecturing, I think all of our community needs to hear this and understand how we've been focused to perform at another culture's level and ours be denied in terms of our intelligence.
Yes.
I just want to say I love you, and I'm so glad I caught this conversation.
All right, stay tuned for, more shows to come. Thank you, Pat, and have a great day. So Dr. DeGruy, and again, we are so grateful to have you on the show today, Dr. Joy DeGruy, author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She was just here at SDC's, and we just want to give a shout-out to SDC for bringing in this phenomenal woman. I know she was here years ago, Salim El-Amin from New Horizons, one of my colleagues. They brought you in, and we're so honored to have you on this show. I want to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care. And my question around trauma-informed care, because it too seems to be the buzzword out here. I'm wondering, when child and family service systems are working with black families, how can they work with black families and not deal with the historical and the ongoing trauma element? Whether we're talking about slavery, whether, there's so many different aspects of our history that I think are left out. What is your take on trauma-informed care? What is the best approach that systems need to take when working with our children and our families?
Okay, so there are a couple of things about, just how you deal with trauma, how you define trauma, all of these things. And the problem is that you have very skilled practitioners, clinicians that understand trauma on a very general, basic level, how it shows up. What they don't have is a context for the extent and the intensity of trauma as it relates to African American people. Not just African American people, but that's where I'm focusing right now.
Yes.
They have no clue as to what they're looking at in terms of the nature of the trauma. They don't understand the nature of the trauma. And so they're trying to use their lens, use their skills and their tools to fix something they don't understand is not, that falls outside the spectrum of clinical diagnosis. You see, there are things that fall outside of that. Things like learned helplessness, things like vacant esteem, things like internalized, all of these are outside the spectrum of what they've learned has any particular value in treating, helping, supporting, or healing people of African descent. Can I give you an example?
Yes.
Okay. So you might have, I tell so many talks. I don't know if I talked about how we developed an African American mental health center in Portland, Oregon. A group of us, there were 7 of us. One of them was Senator Avell Gordley. There was the head of the psychiatry at the #1 teaching hospital, Oregon Health Sciences University, that was with us. My sister. There were a total of 7 of us that were involved. A colleague who was a brilliant scholar, Harold Briggs, who did most of the research in terms of really preparing the assessment instruments. So one of the things that we were trying to do is we were trying to make the case for why we need African Americans serving African Americans as it relates to these traumas.
Okay.
That's what we're trying to make the case, that we need our own Afrocentric, African-centered center of treatment. We were making that argument. Now, mind you, we were trying to make this argument to the state of Oregon and to the county and the city and the feds. We're trying to say we have a community that's in need of this very specific, specialized treatment as it relates to trauma and everything else that's affecting us. Now, I want you to know at the same time that we're making this fight, there is a standalone Latino center. There is a standalone Asian center. There's a standalone, I think, Romanian center. There's a standalone Jewish center. All of these are folks that are Native American center. All of them had one. But when black folks said, we think we need one, let me tell you what the pushback was. I'm going to give it to you. It was amazing. First thing they said was, we've done a number of surveys with people in your community, and there's no evidence to suggest that they would want someone that's African American necessarily. And of course, now I'm a researcher, so I said, and how exactly did you obtain that information? And they said, well, we sent out a number of surveys. And I said, and can you tell me approximately how many of those you got back? And of course, there's a silence because black folks aren't going to respond to that. I already know that about my people. So guess what Joy did? Joy developed a survey. I went to the barbershop. I went to hair salon. I went to church. I went to basketball games. I went to picnics. I went to barbecues. And I came up with hundreds of responses from black people that they wanted to have somebody that looked like them in front of them, right? So now I come back and I prove, no, I just did a survey. These are mine. Show me your numbers. Okay, so now they couldn't use that anymore because now I'm telling them, sharing with them that the average black person says, I would like very much to see folks that look like me. Okay, so we got that. Then they said, well, the problem is we just really don't have enough African-American professionals at the master's level or above. Okay, so that's what they said. So what did I do? I went to all of these suburbs and all of these, surrounding communities where the black folks who were professionals were working because there was no work in the black community, and they were trying to pay off loans and mortgages. And I found them to the tune of 215 of them. Okay.
Wow.
So now I come back, and not only did I find them, I asked them if there was work in our community for you to practice, would you? And they said, of course we would. So I come back now, I got a whole stack of black professionals, master's levels and above. So you can't use that one anymore. Okay. So they said, well, there's really no real evidence that people do any better with, says that an African-American professional is going to be any more effective. Well, first of all, I had to push back a little bit. I go, where's your research? Where is your research that proves that? Well, if you didn't think there were black professionals, you most certainly didn't think to survey them. Or you certainly didn't reach out to my people and talk to them because they didn't respond to you. So I knew that wasn't true, first of all. So what happens, and this is how providence, divine providence shows up. So in the midst of me pushing back on them and actually producing materials that show that culture-specific approaches are more effective, aside from the fact that I had to go and pull up that data, in the meantime, an event occurred in Portland. The event that occurred was there was a huge HMO that wanted to get the federal and state dollars for serving the African American community. By the way, this is why they didn't want us to have one, because the white people wanted to get paid to serve us. That's the bottom line.
Wow.
That was the whole thing. They wanted to get the money to come to them. So what did? They plopped down a pilot clinic in the middle of the black community. They staff it with white people, largely white women. This is what they do. And again, basically, and then they hire a couple of, receptionists that are black, a couple of janitors, and they go, oh, see, we do have black staff.
My Lord.
Okay, now, it gets worse. So then what happens is the director of that particular program, within 30 days, less than 30 days, I think, 1 month, she puts out a memo, which we got a hold of and published. The memo said we will no longer serve angry or agitated black men.
Wow.
That's what she said. So then we, of course, shamed them. And then this actually happened. There's a black man shows up. He shows up to the clinic. Now, the problem is he can't really think straight because he's got bipolar disorder. He lost his job and wasn't able to buy his medication, right? So now he's off his medication for a few weeks, and he's coming to this clinic because he's heard that the white folks here will give you, if you come and be a part of the program, there's some kind of medication program they can put you on. You can get free meds. So that's why he's there. Now let me just tell you, he's about 6'5", 270, right? Big black man. Shows up. Now, you got to remember, he doesn't have a single synapse firing right, but he's trying to get his meds. So he shows up, and who do they send in to assess him? They send Cindy Lou Who from Arkansas with her MSW, LCSW, and all the little W's you need to have. He looks at her, she looks at him. She turns the color of ripened fruit. She's red as a peach. He begins to look at her. He sits down in the chair. He immediately starts to push the chair back. He turns sideways so he can divert his gaze so as not to upset or frighten her. Because even though he don't have a synapse firing right in his head, he knows one thing for sure. Do not scare the white girl. So what ends up happening for him, and I argued this on the steps of the Capitol in Oregon. I went to the Capitol. We had to go all this way to get this. I said, this man had to take care of this white woman so that she could take care of him.
But don't we do that?
But wait a minute. Mm-hmm. But what we don't understand is that injures us.
Yes.
And I made the case that you are injuring him. Her response, the white girl, LCSW, MSW, well, I'm not a racist. My response, I don't care if you're a racist. 300 years of history was in that room, and you were not competent enough to understand it, and perhaps for that reason alone, you should not be in that chair, you should not be behind that desk, and you should not be serving him because you have brought harm to him.
Wow.
And it took 7 years, but we got our clinic.
Well, congratulations. And, the time has passed us by. I think we're over. But I appreciate and I hope you can come back because we need to get a chance to talk about how that the current police department was born out of slavery with the night patrols and the night watches and the slave patrols,
And the Klan.
The Klan, yes. So, but I hope you can come back because you say so many powerful things, and us taking care of white folks when we go into business meetings or we're working for, we always got to be concerned about other folks. So, thank you so much, Dr. Joy DeGruy.
So welcome.
You have a blessed day. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.